A mysterious encounter. The barren landscape of the planet Korn stretched endlessly, its red sands shifting in the wind. The twin suns above beat down mercilessly, their light casting strange shadows over the rocky terrain. Zaire, a young alien woman with silvery skin and violet eyes, trudged through the desert. Her sleek suit was torn in places, and the energy blade at her side flickered weakly. She was running out of time. Her escape pod had crashed 3 days ago. Since then, Zaire had been surviving on ration cubes and the occasional sip of water from a small canister. She knew she couldn't last much longer. Her people, that island, rarely ventured to human-occupied territories, but desperation had brought her here. The humans were known for their ruthlessness and greed, but they also had advanced technology. If she could find one who would help her, she might stand a chance. As she climbed a ridge, Zaire's sharp eyes spotted a glint of metal in the distance. A ship. Her heart leaped with hope and dread at the same time. What if the ship belonged to scavengers or bounty hunters? She had no choice but to take the risk. With careful steps, she approached the vessel. It was a medium-sized human ship, the type used by traders or explorers. The sleek design and faint hum of its engine suggested it was operational, perhaps even recently landed. Zaire crouched behind a large rock, observing. The landing ramp was down, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. Was it a trap? Her heart pounded as she decided to step closer. Just as she reached the edge of the ramp, a voice called out, "Stop right there." Zaire froze. A human male stepped out of the shadows, holding a small but deadly plasma pistol. He was tall, with dark hair that was messy as if he hadn't cared to comb it. His clothes were practical, a mix of armor and fabric suited for travel, but what caught Zaire's attention was the look in his eyes. They weren't angry or threatening. They were tired. "I'm not here to fight," Zaire said cautiously, her voice steady. "I need help." The man studied her for a moment, then lowered his weapon slightly. "Help? From X-Island? That's new." Zaire's violet eyes narrowed. "I don't have time for games. My pod crashed. I'm stranded. If you don't want to help, I'll find someone who will." The man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine. You can come aboard, but don't touch anything." Zaire hesitated. This was too easy. Humans were supposed to be suspicious, always looking for profit. Why wasn't he demanding something in return? Still, she had no better options. She nodded and stepped onto the ship. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of machine oil. The ship's interior was practical, with no signs of luxury. The human gestured for her to sit in a small corner near the cockpit. "What's your name?" he asked, sitting in the pilot's chair and tapping at a console. "Zaire," she replied. "And you?" "Jack," he said without looking up. "So what happened to your ship?" Zaire leaned back, keeping her eyes on him. "I was on a diplomatic mission. We were attacked by pirates. My escape pod malfunctioned, and I ended up here." Jack glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "Sounds rough." "That's it," Zaire asked, her tone sharp. "You're not going to ask what you get in return for helping me." Jack shrugged. "What would you give me?" "Credits. Tech. Your people don't exactly trust humans, so I doubt you'd hand over anything valuable." Zaire was taken aback. "Then why are you helping me?" Jack leaned back in his chair, staring at the console's blinking lights. "Let's just say I've been in your shoes before. I know what it's like to be stranded." There was something in his voice that made Zaire pause. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, like regret or guilt. She studied him carefully. He didn't look like the cruel, profit-driven humans she'd heard about. But that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. "You're different," Zaire said cautiously. "Not like the others." Jack snorted. "Yeah, I get that a lot. Look, I'll check out your pod in the morning. If it's fixable, you're free to go." Zaire frowned. "And if it's not?" Jack met her gaze for the first time. His eyes were piercing, almost challenging. "Then we figure something out." For the first time in days, Zaire felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by unease. This human wasn't what she expected, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, and until she knew what it was, she couldn't fully trust him. As the ship hummed softly around them, Zaire leaned back, her mind racing. Jack might not want anything from her, but she couldn't help but wonder. Why? The odd human. The ship's dimly lit corridors felt strangely comforting to Zaire as she followed Jack into a small workshop at the rear. The hum of machinery and faint scent of grease reminded her of home, though it lacked the elegance of silent engineering. Jack walked ahead, his movements calm but purposeful, as if he had done this routine 1,000 times. "You can sit over there," he said, pointing to a stool near a cluttered workbench. "Just don't touch anything." Zaire raised an eyebrow, but complied, her violet eyes scanning the tools and gadgets scattered across the table. She couldn't help but notice the careful organization beneath the chaos. This human wasn't careless. He was methodical, deliberate. As Jack started tinkering with her damaged transport beacon, Zaire studied him. Unlike the humans she had imagined, loud, brash, and overconfident, Jack seemed uninterested in boasting or even explaining himself. His silence was unnerving. "Do you always take in random strangers?" she asked, breaking the quiet. Jack didn't look up. "Nope." "Then why me?" He paused, his hand stilling over the device. For a moment, Zaire thought he wouldn't answer. Then he shrugged, his voice low. "You needed help. That's reason enough." Zaire leaned forward, her tone skeptical. "Humans don't do things without expecting something in return. What's your angle?" Jack sighed, placing the beacon down and rubbing his temples. "You Cylon really do think the worst of us, don't you?" "History supports it," she shot back, crossing her arms. "Fair enough," Jack muttered, returning to his work. The conversation stalled again, but Zaire wasn't done. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jack was different, not just from the stories she'd heard, but from anyone she'd ever met. He didn't act like someone who wanted to exploit her, nor did he seem interested in earning her trust. It was as if he wanted nothing at all, and that made him all the more intriguing. "I overheard your ship's name earlier," Zaire said after a long pause. "The Solace. That's an unusual name." Jack chuckled softly, a sound more like air escaping his lungs. "Yeah, I guess it is. It belonged to someone else before me. I kept the name out of respect." "Respect?" Zaire tilted her head. "For who?" He glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "Someone who saved my life once." Zaire opened her mouth to ask more, but Jack's demeanor made it clear he wouldn't elaborate. She felt a pang of frustration. Why was he so guarded? As Jack worked, Zaire noticed small details about him. The scars on his hands, the worn patches on his jacket, and the faint shadows under his eyes. This was a man who had seen his share of battles, who had probably lost more than he cared to admit. And yet, here he was, fixing her beacon without asking for so much as a thank you. "Your beacon's fried," Jack said suddenly, breaking her train of thought. "What?" Zaire stood, alarmed. "You can't fix it." "Not completely," Jack replied, turning the device over in his hands. "The core's intact, but the signal booster's shot. I can rig something to get it working temporarily, but it won't last long." Zaire's heart sank. Without a fully functioning beacon, her chances of contacting a rescue ship were slim. Jack must have noticed her expression because he added, "It's not hopeless. I've got a spare booster in storage. I can try to integrate it, but it'll take time." "Why would you do that for me?" Zaire asked, her voice soft. Jack shrugged again, his focus back on the device. "Because I can." Zaire sat back down, her mind racing. Jack's actions made no sense. Humans were supposed to be selfish and calculating, yet he was helping her without any apparent motive. What was he hiding? Hours passed as Jack worked in silence. Zaire found herself watching him, her initial suspicion slowly giving way to curiosity. She noticed how he frowned slightly when concentrating, how his hands moved with precision, and how he occasionally muttered to himself. He wasn't just competent, he was skilled. "Done," Jack finally said, setting the beacon down. Zaire leaned forward, examining the makeshift repairs. The device looked crude, but it hummed with life. "It's not pretty, but it'll do the job," Jack said. Zaire met his gaze, searching for any hint of deceit. She found none. "Thank you." Jack waved her gratitude away. "Don't mention it." As she held the beacon in her hands, Zaire couldn't shake the feeling that Jack was more than he appeared. He didn't want her gratitude, her company, or her trust. But why? What kind of human helped a stranger and asked for nothing in return? As the ship hummed softly around them, Zaire made a silent vow. She would find out what Jack was hiding, even if it meant staying longer than she'd planned. Something about him didn't add up, and Zaire wasn't one to leave mysteries unsolved. A silent bond. The days aboard Solace passed with an unusual rhythm. Zaire hadn't planned to stay long, but with her beacon only partially functional, and Jack insisting on making additional adjustments, she found herself with little choice. Jack's ship wasn't luxurious. Far from it. But it was safe, and that was enough for now. Jack remained as reserved as ever, speaking only when necessary, and often retreating into his own world of mechanical tinkering. Zaire, who had grown up in a society where communication and connection were vital, found his silence both infuriating and intriguing. He wasn't rude or dismissive. He simply seemed content to be alone. One afternoon, Zaire wandered into the main deck where Jack was working. He was crouched under a console, sparks flying as he soldered a damaged circuit. His jacket was tossed over a nearby chair, revealing a plain shirt and scars that crisscrossed his forearms. They weren't fresh, but they told a story of battles fought long before she'd met him. "You never stop working, do you?" Zaire asked, leaning against the doorframe. Jack didn't look up. "Something always needs fixing." Zaire crossed the room, her steps deliberate. "And what about you? When do you stop to fix yourself?" Jack paused, his hand stilling. For a moment, she thought he might snap back with some sarcastic remark, but instead, he resumed his work. "Some things can't be fixed." His words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Zaire frowned but decided not to push further. Instead, she perched on a nearby chair, watching him work. It had become a sort of unspoken ritual between them. Jack would work, and Zaire would observe, occasionally throwing in a comment to break the silence. As the hours passed, Zaire found herself noticing more about Jack. He was meticulous, almost obsessive, with his repairs. Every wire was carefully aligned, every bolt tightened just enough. It was as if he found solace in the precision of his work, a way to drown out whatever ghosts haunted him. "You were a soldier," Zaire said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Jack stiffened but didn't respond. "I can tell," she continued. "The way you move, the way you handle tools, it's second nature to you. You've been trained for survival." Jack finally sat back, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't meet her gaze. "I was." Zaire tilted her head. "And now?" "Now I'm just a guy with a ship," he said simply, standing and walking toward the cockpit. Zaire didn't follow. She knew when someone wanted to be left alone. But Jack's evasiveness only deepened her curiosity. What had happened to him? What had turned a soldier into a solitary wanderer? Later that evening, Zaire found herself in the ship's small galley, rummaging through storage compartments. The food on board was basic: nutrient bars, dried rations, and a few cans of something she couldn't identify. She wrinkled her nose but grabbed a bar anyway. Survival wasn't about luxury. As she sat at the table, Jack walked in, his hair slightly disheveled from hours of work. He grabbed a ration pack and sat across from her without a word. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It had become a strange kind of comfort. "You don't trust people, do you?" Zaire asked, breaking the quiet. Jack looked up, his expression unreadable. "Depends on the person." "And me?" Jack shrugged. "Haven't decided yet." Zaire smirked. "Fair enough. But you don't seem like the trusting type. Neither do you, Jack countered, his tone calm but pointed. Zaire chuckled, conceding the point. Touché. They ate in silence for a while, the hum of the ship filling the gaps in their conversation. For all his distance, Jack wasn't unkind. He shared his resources without complaint and even adjusted the ship's temperature when Zaire mentioned the cold. He didn't seek her gratitude or friendship, but his actions spoke louder than words. One night, Zaire couldn't sleep. She wandered into the cockpit, where she found Jack staring out at the endless expanse of stars. The dim light of the control panels cast a soft glow on his face, highlighting the tired lines around his eyes. "You don't sleep much, do you?" Zaire asked, stepping inside. Jack didn't turn. "Old habit. From your soldier days." "Something like that," he replied, his voice low. Zaire sat in the co-pilot's chair, her gaze fixed on him. "You know, you're a mystery. Most humans I've met can't stop talking about themselves, but you barely say a word." Jack finally looked at her, his eyes piercing. "Not every story needs to be told." "Maybe not," Zaire said, leaning back. "But sometimes sharing it helps." Jack's gaze softened, but he said nothing. They sat in silence, the stars stretching endlessly before them. In that moment, Zaire realized something unexpected. Jack wasn't just avoiding her, he was protecting himself. Whatever he'd been through had left scars deeper than the ones on his skin. Over the following days, Zaire began to see glimpses of the man behind the walls. Jack wasn't unkind. He was cautious. He wasn't cold. He was guarded. And despite her initial skepticism, Zaire found herself drawn to his quiet strength. Jack, too, seemed to be softening. He didn't talk much, but he started leaving small things for her: an extra blanket, a better ration bar, even a repaired energy blade. He never mentioned them, but Zaire noticed. It was his way of saying, "I see you. I care." A silent bond was forming between them, unspoken but undeniable. For the first time in days, Zaire felt a strange sense of peace. She still didn't fully trust Jack, but she was beginning to understand him. And that, she realized, was the first step. The human who didn't want her gratitude was becoming the one she trusted the most. A dangerous revelation. The solace was unusually quiet, its hum subdued as it drifted through a desolate starfield. Zaire had spent most of the day pacing the narrow corridors, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. Jack was the kind of person who said little but revealed much in the way he acted. And the more she watched him, the more she realized how carefully he seemed to keep his distance, not just physically, but emotionally. Zaire decided to occupy herself by exploring the ship's cargo bay. She had avoided it initially, assuming it was just filled with spare parts and tools. But curiosity won over. As she stepped inside, the room greeted her with dim lighting and rows of neatly stacked crates. One particular crate caught her eye. Unlike the others, this one had an active lock panel with a faint blue glow. It seemed out of place. Zaire approached it cautiously, her sharp violet eyes narrowing as she examined the controls. The crate was marked with a strange insignia, a human military emblem. Her instincts screamed at her to leave it alone, but her curiosity was louder. With a swift press of her fingers, she hacked into the crate's locking mechanism, a skill she'd honed long before her diplomatic career. The lock clicked open, and the lid hissed as it slid aside. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. A communicator rested on top of a pile of other equipment, its screen flashing faintly with recent messages. The name on the display read, "Bounty received. Target, Zaire." Zaire's chest tightened as she stared at the words. Her mind raced. Jack had said he wasn't interested in credits or rewards, yet here it was, a direct communication linking him to the bounty on her head. Was this why he'd taken her in? To lull her into a false sense of security before cashing her in for a profit? Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the crate, her thoughts a chaotic blur. She needed to confront him, But she also needed to be careful. Jack was skilled, resourceful, and unpredictable. If this was a trap, she couldn't let him know she'd discovered it. Zaire found Jack in the cockpit, leaning back in the pilot's chair with his feet propped up on the console. He looked utterly relaxed, as if he had no care in the world. That only fueled her anger. "I need to talk to you," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. Jack raised an eyebrow, lowering his feet to the floor. "Something wrong?" Zaire crossed her arms, keeping her expression neutral. "I found something in the cargo bay. Care to explain why there's a message about my bounty on your communicator?" For the first time, Jack's relaxed demeanor cracked. His eyes hardened, and his jaw tightened as he stood. "You went through my things." "I had a reason," Zaire shot back, her voice rising. "You've been hiding this the whole time. Were you planning to hand me over when it was convenient?" Jack's gaze didn't waver, but his voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "If I wanted to hand you over, I wouldn't have fixed your beacon or kept you alive this long." "That doesn't explain the message," Zaire pressed, her fists clenching. Jack exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "The message isn't mine. It's an automated alert from my old network. They keep tabs on high-value targets, and your name showed up. I didn't ask for it. I didn't want it." Zaire's anger wavered, replaced by confusion. "Then why didn't you delete it? Why keep something so dangerous on your ship?" "Because deleting it would raise a flag," Jack said, his tone softening. "If they think I'm hiding you, they'll come after me. Right now, they think I'm just another guy with an outdated comm system." Zaire's mind raced as she processed his explanation. It made sense, but it still didn't answer the bigger question. "Why are you risking so much for me? You barely know me." Jack's eyes softened, and for a moment, he looked almost vulnerable. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted. To have nowhere to go and no one to trust. I wouldn't wish that on anyone." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Zaire's anger dissolved, replaced by a strange mix of guilt and gratitude. She had been so quick to assume the worst, but Jack had done nothing to deserve her mistrust. Their conversation was interrupted by a shrill alarm that echoed through the ship. Jack's expression darkened as he rushed to the console, his fingers flying over the controls. "What is it?" Zaire asked, moving to stand beside him. "Trouble," Jack muttered. "A ship just dropped out of warp. It's a bounty hunter." Zaire's heart sank. "They found me." Jack didn't respond. His focus was entirely on the controls as he powered up the ship's defenses. The Solace wasn't built for combat, but Jack seemed calm, almost too calm. "Get to the back. And stay low," Jack ordered, his voice steady. "I'm not hiding," Zaire snapped. "Listen to me," Jack said, turning to face her. "If they board this ship, they'll kill both of us. Let me handle it." For a moment, Zaire considered arguing, but the intensity in Jack's gaze stopped her. She nodded reluctantly and retreated to the cargo bay, her mind racing. The Solace shook as the bounty hunter's ship fired a warning shot. Jack's hands moved with practiced precision as he maneuvered the ship, dodging the next volley. He activated the cloaking device, a crude modification he'd installed years ago, and the Solace vanished from the hunter's scanners. In the cargo bay, Zaire crouched behind a crate, gripping her energy blade tightly. She could hear the muffled sounds of Jack's voice over the comms, taunting the hunter and leading them on a chase. Minutes felt like hours as Zaire waited, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, the ship stopped shaking, and Jack's voice came through the intercom. "They're gone. You're safe." Zaire exhaled, relief washing over her. She didn't know how Jack had done it, but he had bought them more time. As she made her way back to the cockpit, one thought consumed her mind. This human was willing to risk everything for her. But why? The truth unveiled. The aftermath of the bounty hunter's attack left the Solace drifting silently through space. The ship's systems were stable, but the tension between Jack and Zaire was anything but. Zaire sat in the cockpit, her arms crossed and her eyes locked on Jack, who was running diagnostics on the console, as if nothing had happened. "That was too close," Zaire said, breaking the silence. Jack grunted in agreement, his focus on the flickering screen. Zaire wasn't satisfied. "You could have handed me over. You could have saved yourself a lot of trouble. Why didn't you?" Jack's fingers paused on the keyboard. He didn't look at her, but she could see the slight clench of his jaw. "We've been over this. I'm not that kind of person." "That's not an answer," Zaire pressed, her voice rising. "You keep saying you're helping me out of the goodness of your heart, but no one does that without a reason. So, what is it, Jack? What aren't you telling me?" Jack exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he just stared at the star-filled void outside the cockpit window. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Do you know what it's like to trust someone with your life and have them throw it away?" Zaire blinked, caught off guard by the question. What do you mean?" Jack finally turned to face her. His eyes were hard, but beneath the steel, there was something else, a deep, unhealed wound. "A long time ago, I had a crew," he began. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, like he was forcing himself to keep it together. "We were explorers, freelancers. We weren't rich, but we got by. One day, we took on an silent passenger, a diplomat, like you. They needed safe passage through contested space, and we needed the credits." Zaire's stomach tightened. She didn't interrupt. Jack continued, his tone growing colder. "We treated them like one of our own. Shared our food, trusted them to watch our backs. But it was all a lie. They were working with a pirate syndicate. Sold us out the second we reached the edge of the system." Zaire's heart sank. "What happened?" Jack's jaw tightened. "We didn't see the ambush coming. They hit us hard. My crew, my family, didn't stand a chance. I barely made it out alive. The ship was destroyed, and I was left floating in an escape pod for days before someone found me." Zaire's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." Jack shook his head. "Sorry doesn't bring them back. After that, I swore I'd never trust another Kylan. Never let anyone close enough to stab me in the back again." The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating. Zaire didn't know what to say. She had heard stories of betrayal during the conflicts between their species, but hearing it directly from someone who had lived through it was different. "So why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because you're not them. I can see it in your eyes. You're scared, you're desperate, but you're not a liar. And maybe I'm tired of carrying all this anger." Zaire felt a lump rise in her throat. She had never expected to see this side of him, the vulnerable, broken man hiding beneath the stoic facade. For the first time, she understood why he kept his distance, why he was so guarded. "I'm not like them," she said softly. "I swear to you, Jack, I'll never betray your trust." He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the silence stretching between them like a fragile bridge. The next day, Jack called Zaire to the cargo bay. She found him standing beside a crate, his arms crossed. "I've been working on your beacon," he said. "It's fully operational now. You can use it to call for a rescue ship." Zaire felt a pang of sadness. She had been so focused on surviving that she hadn't thought about what would happen once she left. "And then what?" she asked. Jack shrugged. "Then you go home, and I go back to my life. Simple as that." Zaire frowned. "Is it?" Jack didn't answer. Instead, he handed her the beacon. "You'll be safe. That's what matters." As she took the device, Zaire realized that leaving wouldn't feel like the victory she had imagined. In the short time they'd spent together, Jack had become more than just her rescuer. He was someone she respected, someone she cared about. "Jack," she said hesitantly, "what if I don't want to leave?" He looked at her, startled. "What are you talking about?" "I mean it," she said, her voice firm. "You saved my life. You've shown me kindness I didn't deserve. I can't just walk away and forget all of this." Jack's expression softened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "This isn't your fight, sire. You have a home to go back to, a life waiting for you." "And what about you?" she countered. "Are you just going to keep drifting through space, running from your past?" Jack didn't reply. Zaire stepped closer, her voice gentle. "You've been alone long enough, Jack. Maybe it's time to stop pushing people away." Jack looked at her for a long moment, his walls slowly crumbling. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe you're right." In that moment, something shifted between them. The wounds of the past hadn't healed, but they had begun to scab over. Jack had let someone in, and Zaire had found someone worth staying for. For the first time in years, neither of them felt completely alone. A selfless act. The Solace was on high alert. Jack and Zaire had barely started discussing their next steps when the ship's sensors blared a warning. A hostile signal had entered the system. A ship from the bounty hunters faction, larger and more heavily armed than the one before. Jack's hands flew across the console as he scanned the approaching vessel. His expression was grim. They must have tracked us, probably picked up residual traces from the last skirmish. Zaire stood behind him, her mind racing. "Can we outrun them?" "Not this one," Jack muttered, his jaw tightening. "They've got us outgunned and outmaneuvered. If we try to run, they'll catch us. If we fight." He trailed off, shaking his head. Zaire's stomach dropped. She knew what he was thinking. "Jack, we can't let them board. If they take me, they'll kill you too." "Not if I give them what they want," Jack said, his tone sharp. Zaire froze, her heart pounding. "You're not seriously considering." "Relax," Jack interrupted. "I'm not handing you over. But I am going to buy us some time." "How?" Zaire demanded, stepping closer. Jack glanced at her, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "By making them think you're already gone." Within minutes, Jack had a plan. It was risky, reckless, and probably suicidal, but it was the only chance they had. He worked quickly, rigging a decoy beacon to emit Zaire's life signature. The signal would draw the enemy ship away, but only if it looked convincing. Zaire watched him work, her chest tight with anxiety. "You're risking everything for me," she said, her voice barely audible. Jack didn't look up. "I've already told you, this isn't about risk. It's about doing the right thing." "But what happens to you if this doesn't work?" Zaire asked, her tone growing more desperate. "What if they don't fall for it?" Jack finally stopped and turned to her, his gaze steady. "If it doesn't work, we go to Plan B." "And what's Plan B?" "I haven't figured that out yet," he admitted with a wry smile. Zaire wanted to argue, to tell him that his plan was insane, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Jack was the kind of person who didn't back down once he'd made up his mind. And as reckless as he was, she trusted him. The enemy ship closed in, its massive silhouette looming on the ship's sensors. Jack activated the decoy beacon and transmitted the false coordinates. "Here we go," he muttered, gripping the controls tightly. Zaire stood behind him, holding her breath as the seconds stretched into an eternity. The enemy ship hovered on the edge of their range, its scanners sweeping the area. "Come on," Jack whispered under his breath. "Take the bait." Suddenly, the enemy ship turned, its engines flaring as it veered toward the decoy's location. Zaire let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. "They're moving away," she said, her voice trembling. Jack didn't relax. Not yet. They could still circle back. He kept the Solace stationary, cloaked and silent, as the enemy ship disappeared into the distance. Only when the sensors confirmed they were alone did he lean back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "We did it," Zaire said, her voice filled with awe. "For now," Jack replied. "But they'll realize it's a decoy sooner or later. We need to move fast." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Jack plotted a course to a nearby asteroid field where they could hide while he repaired the ship's damaged systems. Zaire helped as best she could, though her thoughts kept drifting back to what Jack had done for her. He hadn't just risked his life, he put himself in the crosshairs of an entire faction, all to protect someone he barely knew. As they worked, Zaire couldn't hold back any longer. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her voice breaking. Jack paused, his hand stilling over the console. He didn't look at her as he spoke. "Because if I don't, who will? I've seen too many people suffer because no one was willing to stand up for them. I'm not going to let that happen again." Zaire felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had spent so much of her life hearing about human cruelty, about their greed and selfishness. But Jack was living proof that there was more to them than the stories her people told. "You're not like anyone I've ever met," she said softly. Jack glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And you're not half as bad as I thought you'd be." Zaire laughed despite herself, the tension in her chest easing for the first time in days. As the Solace slipped into the safety of the asteroid field, Zaire sat in the cockpit beside Jack, staring out at the stars. "Thank you," she said after a long silence. Jack didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "You don't have to thank me. Just don't waste the chance you've been given." Zaire nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She would never forget the man who had risked everything to save her. And as they drifted through the vast emptiness of space, a fragile but unbreakable bond began to form between them. One built on trust, sacrifice, and the belief that even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, there was still light to be found. A new beginning. The asteroid field provided a temporary refuge, its dense rocks and shadows concealing the Solace from prying eyes. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was still tense, but there was an undercurrent of something lighter. Relief, perhaps, or the cautious hope that the worst was finally behind them. Zaire stood in the cargo bay, staring at the repaired beacon Jack had handed her earlier. The small device hummed softly in her hands, its glowing indicator light a reminder that she could call for a rescue ship whenever she was ready. Yet the thought of leaving didn't fill her with the excitement she had expected. Jack entered the bay, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag. He stopped when he saw her, his expression unreadable. "It's working now. You can send the signal whenever you want." Zaire nodded but didn't move. She stared at the device for a moment longer before setting it down on a nearby crate. Jack frowned. "What are you waiting for? The sooner you call for help, the sooner you'll be safe." Zaire turned to face him, her violet eyes searching his face. "And what about you? What happens to you after I'm gone?" Jack shrugged, his tone casual. "Same as always. I keep moving. It's what I do." "That's not much of a life," Zaire said softly. Jack let out a dry laugh. "Maybe not, but it's the one I've got." Zaire stepped closer, her voice firm. "It doesn't have to be. You don't have to keep running, Jack. You don't have to be alone." Jack's expression shifted, the cracks in his stoic facade beginning to show. "I've been alone for a long time, Zaire. It's easier that way." "Easier, maybe," she said. "But is it better?" Jack didn't answer. He turned away, busying himself with rearranging tools on a nearby shelf. Zaire watched him, her heart aching for the man who had risked everything to save her, but refused to save himself. Later that evening, Zaire found Jack in the cockpit. He was staring out at the stars, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the ship's controls. She sat in the co-pilot's chair, folding her hands in her lap. "You know," she began, her voice quiet, "I came here expecting humans to be everything my people warned me about. Ruthless, greedy, untrustworthy." Jack snorted but didn't look at her. "And what do you think now?" "I think they're wrong," she said. "At least about you." Jack finally turned to face her, his eyes shadowed but intense. "Don't put me on a pedestal, Zaire. I'm no hero." "I'm not asking you to be," she replied. But you're not the villain my people made you out to be either. You've shown me more kindness and courage than anyone I've ever known. Jack leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. You're giving me too much credit. Zaire shook her head. No, I'm not. You've saved my life more times than I can count. You've risked everything for me. And you've asked for nothing in return. If that's not worth admiring, I don't know what is. Jack was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I didn't want you to go through what I did. That's all. And you've done more than enough, Zaire said. But now it's my turn to help you. Jack raised an eyebrow. Help me? How? Zaire smiled, her expression soft but determined. By staying. Jack blinked, clearly taken aback. Staying? Yes, she said. You've been running for so long, Jack. Maybe it's time to stop. Maybe it's time to let someone in. He stared at her, his defenses crumbling under the weight of her words. You don't have to do that. You have a home to go back to, people who are probably looking for you. Zaire nodded. I know, but that doesn't mean I can't choose a different path. And right now, I'm choosing this. Jack looked away, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. You're taking a risk, Zaire. I'm not an easy person to be around. She reached out, placing a hand on his. Neither am I, but maybe we can figure it out together. Jack glanced at her hand, then back at her face. For the first time since they met, he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. You're stubborn, you know that. Zaire grinned. Takes one to know one. The next morning, Zaire didn't activate the beacon. Instead, she and Jack began making preparations for their next journey. The Solace would need more repairs, and they would have to lay low for a while to avoid the bounty hunters. But for the first time in years, Jack wasn't dreading what lay ahead. As they stood in the cockpit, watching the asteroid field fade into the distance, Zaire turned to him. So, where to next? Jack smirked. Anywhere but here. Zaire laughed, her heart feeling lighter than it had in days. Sounds good to me. The Solace slipped into warp, carrying them toward an uncertain but promising future. For Jack, it was a chance to heal and start over. For Zaire, it was an opportunity to rewrite the stories her people had told about humans. Together, they had found something neither of them had expected. A new beginning. And as the stars streaked past the cockpit window, they both knew that wherever they went, they wouldn't face it alone.